They taught you the most dangerous secrets are hidden in vaults. That's a children's story. The real ones are spoken out loud, in rooms where you're not allowed to react. Listen closely. When a man strikes a woman in a courtroom, the slap isn't the shock. The shock is what the room does next. Because in that silence, power makes a decision about what reality will be. And once you understand that, you will never sit the same way in any public building again. The air in Courtroom for B was antiseptic. Waxed floors, old timber, December rain hammering high glass like it was trying to break in and testify. On one side, Brandon Mercer, billionaire CEO, sleek suit, predatory calm, eyes that priced people like assets. On the other side, Haley Mercer, 8 months pregnant, hands over her belly like she was shielding the last clean thing left in her life. Everyone could feel it, the imbalance. Not just money versus fear, but something older. The ancient law of ownership, dressed in modern fabrics and legal language. Brandon didn't come to court to be judged. He came to close a transaction. He checked his watch like the verdict was already printed, like the judge was just another employee behind a counter. His attorneys sat behind him like a phalanx, polished teeth and perfect ties, men trained to turn bruises into accidents and isolation into estrangement. And Haley's court-appointed lawyer looked like she'd slept in a chair for 3 nights straight, because she probably had. That's how the system shows you what it values. The man who can buy time and the woman who is forced to beg for it. Then the judge walked in, silver hair, blue eyes, posture carved from consequence. No quorums, no softness, just a presence that made even the bailiff straighten his spine. Brandon smirked anyway, because men like him don't read faces. They read leverage, and he thought he had it. He didn't know that the bench wasn't just a place of authority. It was a burial ground for liars. The hearing began the way these rituals always begin, with language designed to erase a human being. Hormonal, unstable, no support. Words that sound clinical but function like shackles. They weren't arguing the truth. They were manufacturing a story strong enough to survive the news cycle. And Brandon, Brandon, sat there like a king listening to peasants debate the weather. Until Haley spoke one sentence that cracked the script. He told her mother was dead. You felt it, didn't you? That microscopic shift, the courtroom's oxygen thinning. Because now the case wasn't custody. It was captivity. And somewhere behind the judge's eyes, something moved that wasn't law. Recognition. The kind that turns a courtroom into a hunting ground. Brandon stood up, stepped toward Haley, and the room did what it always does when wealth approaches violence. It hesitated. That hesitation is the secret architecture of control. And then his hand came down, not just on her cheek, on the illusion that anyone in that room was safe from him. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Haley folded inward, sobbing, apologizing like a prisoner who thinks pain is her fault. And the judge's chair scraped back hard enough to make people flinch. She stood, not like an official rising, but like a mother waking up from a 3-year coma. In that moment, you could almost see the mask shatter and fall. The bailiff moved, cuffs out. Brandon started to protest, because his entire life was built on the belief that consequences were for other men. And the judge's voice hit the room like a blade. Restrain him, now. But here's where the story turns into something older than law. The judge didn't just look at Haley as a plaintiff. She looked at her as blood. And when she came down from the bench and knelt beside her, the courtroom learned a truth it was never built to hold. Sometimes the person with the gavel is also the person you tried to erase from your victim's life. Haley lifted her eyes, saw those familiar blue irises through tears, and whispered a word that detonated the entire power structure in one breath. Mom, you need to understand what happened next, because it wasn't just karma. That's the bedtime version people tell themselves so they can keep believing the world is fair. What happened next was something colder. A system suddenly realizing it had misidentified who held the blade. When Haley whispered, Mom, the courtroom didn't just gasp, it recalculated. You could feel it, the way air changes when a predator realizes the room has witnesses who matter. Brandon Mercer's face drained, not with guilt, but with the first honest fear of his adult life, the fear of being seen accurately. Because men like him don't fear jail. They fear loss of narrative. Jail is a room. The narrative is the empire. Judge Margaret Davis, no Margaret, because that's what she became in that instant, held her daughter's face like she was afraid Haley would disappear if she blinked. Her fingers trembled, careful not to touch the blooming red mark on Haley's cheek. And Haley did what abused people do when the world finally sees their bruises. She apologized. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have upset him. That sentence should haunt you. It's not a weakness. It's conditioning. It's psychological ownership. It's the aftertaste of years spent learning that survival means taking responsibility for someone else's violence." Behind them, Brandon was cuffed and still trying to buy the room with volume. He barked about lawsuits, about badges, about how he could purchase the courthouse brick by brick. The bailiffs tightened their grip because they'd heard this before. Men who weaponize money like a religion. Brandon's attorney tried to salvage it with procedure. Conflict of interest, recusal, mistrial. Legal magic words meant to rewrap a monster in paperwork and roll him out the back door. And Margaret did something you need to file away for the rest of your life. She didn't argue emotion. She used authority like a hammer. She stood, walked back to the bench, and her voice became the kind that makes grown men stop moving. She announced her recusal, yes, but she did it after she carved Brandon's options down to bone. Bench warrant, immediate arrest, aggravated assault, contempt, witness intimidation, bail denied due to flight risk. Each phrase landed like a weight on Brandon's chest. This wasn't a mother screaming. This was the machine of law turning its full face toward him for the first time. And the machine is terrifying when it finally decides you're the problem. But power hates being cornered. Brandon's eyes weren't pleading. They were calculating. Even being dragged away, he wasn't thinking, "I hurt her." He was thinking, "How do I reset control?" Because control is an addiction. Not love. Not family. Control. And right as the door slammed, Haley's body betrayed the truth her mind had been forced to hide. She clutched her stomach and went pale. A dark stain spread beneath her. Her water broke. Stress and trauma pulled the child toward the world early, like the baby could sense the war outside and wanted out of the battlefield. Margaret screamed for a medic like she couldn't believe oxygen could still exist in a building where that man had been standing. Hours later, the hospital waiting room was fluorescent purgatory. Plastic chairs, cheap coffee, the hum of machines that sound like indifferent gods. Margaret sat there in her robes, collar loosened, hands clasped so hard her knuckles looked carved. She didn't look like a judge anymore. She looked like the truth, exhausted. Haley's lawyer sat nearby, trying to act professional while the world burned. And that's when the second layer revealed itself. This wasn't just domestic abuse. It was a strategy. Margaret admitted something softly, like confessing a sin. For 3 years she'd believed Haley chose distance. Letters returned. Calls unanswered. A typed message with Haley's signature telling her mother to drop dead. That's not just isolation, that's identity theft. That's someone intercepting reality and rewriting it. Abusers don't just hit. The competent ones falsify your universe until you don't know which memories are safe to trust. They sever the victim from every mirror that could reflect her worth. When the doctor finally came out, tired eyes, gentle voice, he said the baby was alive. A boy, small, early, strong. Relief cracked Margaret open and she sobbed like a woman who'd been holding an ocean behind her ribs. Haley asked the question that matters. He has so much money. He'll take him. Margaret's answer was a promise and a threat. He thinks money is power, but he forgot one thing. He committed a felony on record. And I know the law better than any lawyer he can hire. That sounds comforting, until you see what happens when a man like Brandon realizes he can't win in court. He stops trying to win in court. He starts trying to win the world. Here's the part most people never learn, because they still believe justice is a courtroom event. Justice is a supply chain. It moves through relationships, favors, headlines, and fear. Brandon Mercer walked out of booking less than a day later, dressed in a fresh suit like the arrest was a networking inconvenience. That's not a plot twist. That's the rule in a society where money doesn't just buy comfort, it buys momentum. It buys the right to keep moving while everyone else is forced to stand still and explain themselves. On the precinct steps, microphones bloomed like vultures. Brandon didn't shout. He didn't rage. He performed. And performance is one of the oldest psychological control systems in history. If you can narrate the event first, you can tattoo your version onto the public's mind before facts have shoes on. His attorney framed it as an ambush, a vendetta, a family grudge. He used the sacred language of fairness to protect a man who just struck a pregnant woman. Watch how clean that trick is. They didn't deny the violence. They reclassified it. Then Brandon stepped forward and did something only dangerous men can do convincingly. He pretended to be broken. His voice trembled just enough to be believable. He used the word episodes. He used the phrase, trying to stop her from hurting herself. He made love sound like restraint. And if you've never seen this technique, print it now. The abuser doesn't just reverse victim and offender. He recruits the audience to help him do it. He makes you feel noble for doubting her. In the hospital, Haley watched that broadcast and you could feel her reality destabilize. Because psychological captivity doesn't end when the door locks open. It ends when the victim's mind stops accepting the captor's script. And Brandon's script was everywhere. On screens, in headlines, in whispered conversations between nurses who didn't know her story but knew his name. Everyone will believe him, Haley said. That sentence is the true hand around her throat. Not his fingers. The belief that the world is already bought. Margaret tried to hold the line with what she knew. Security, procedure, legal allies. But then the truth surfaced, and it was uglier than bruises. Haley admitted something she'd overheard. Something Brandon never intended her to understand. A legacy trust. Voting shares. A will clause. Brandon didn't want the baby because fatherhood transformed him. He wanted the baby because a male heir functioned like a key. Before his 35th birthday. Next month. That's why he tracked her cycle. That's why he locked her in. That's why he lied about her mother being dead. Haley wasn't a wife. She was a time-sensitive mechanism. This is what institutions call private family matters. But it isn't private. It's corporate governance with a heartbeat. It's ancient succession logic wearing a modern suit. A child as leverage. A woman as a vessel. A family as a battlefield where the prize is control of an empire that moves goods across oceans and money across borders. And now you see the deeper agenda. Brandon was not fighting for love. He was fighting to prevent an audit. To prevent exposure. To keep the board from smelling blood. Desperation is what turns a rich man into a cornered animal. It's what makes him reach for tools beyond the law, tools that operate in the shadow economy of influence. So he hired a specialist, not a lawyer, not a PR guy, a reputation manager, a man with a forgettable face and a job that is as old as kings. Destroy the credibility of the person who threatens you. Bots seeded stories about Margaret taking bribes. A former clerk ready to testify she drank in chambers. The goal wasn't to prove anything. The goal was to fog the mirror until no one could see straight. This is institutional manipulation at its simplest. If truth can't be killed, bury it under noise. Brandon looked out over the city like it belonged to him and asked the only question he cared about. Did you fix the judge? Fix. Like a broken appliance. Like a dog that won't obey. And when he learned Haley was protected inside the hospital, he didn't say, I should apologize. He said, I need that boy. Because the board meeting was coming. Because if he didn't walk in with a birth certificate and custody papers, the vultures would trigger a clause and tear him apart. Then the reputation manager offered the solution that always arrives when you threaten a man's throne. Remove the obstacle permanently. What if the mother is incapacitated? Not discredited. Not delayed. Incapacitated. And Brandon, without hesitation, whispered the sentence that tells you everything. Do it. Make it look like an accident. If you've never felt the temperature drop inside your own body while listening to a plan to become murder, you're feeling it now. Because that's the moment the mask comes off and you realize the real battlefield isn't court, it's consequence. Brandon wasn't improvising. He was escalating down a ladder that has existed for centuries. First you isolate, then you discredit, then you intimidate, and if that fails, you erase. The system doesn't always stop you. The system often just asks you to do it quietly. Margaret understood this with the kind of clarity you only earn after a lifetime sentencing liars. She didn't go home. She didn't sit under warm lights and pretend the law was a force field. She went to the back booth of a dim diner in Queens, wearing a cap and sunglasses like a fugitive in her own city, and slid a manila envelope across the table to a detective who owed her favors. That is the ugly truth of institutional reality. Everything runs on favors. Not justice. Favors. Relationships. Pressure. Quiet debts. The same machinery Brandon uses, Margaret now had to use too, because the rules don't protect you from a man who has stopped respecting rules. She asked the detective to look at Mercer Logistics' shipping routes and container weights. Empty containers returning heavier than they should. Not proof yet. Suspicion. A judge's gut. And here's what you should learn from that. The instinct that something is wrong is often the only warning you get before the world changes shape. Margaret didn't need to know the whole crime. She needed to find the seam where the crime would split open. Then her phone buzzed. Code red. CPS is here. This is the part that should make your stomach turn because it's not dramatic. It's common. The most effective weapon isn't a gun. It's a form. Brandon couldn't breach the hospital with force, so he sent the state. Child Protective Services. Emergency removal. Allegations of instability. Claims of homelessness. Claims that the grandmother, the judge, was under investigation. Paperwork used as a crowbar to pry a newborn from a mother's arms. And the genius of it is that it looks like safety. That's why it works. Institutional manipulation always wears a halo. In the hallway outside the NICU, the scene was pure modern ritual. Social workers with blank faces, officers waiting for instructions, Brandon's lawyer waving documents like scripture. Haley screamed. Not movie screams, animal screams. The kind that comes from deep time, from mothers in caves. You can't take him. He needs me. And the social worker answered in a tone designed to erase emotion. It's for the child's safety. That's how the machine speaks while it steals. Margaret arrived like a storm and planted herself in front of the NICU doors. A 60-year-old woman, bruised by grief and powered by rage, arms crossed as if she could physically block the state. She didn't appeal. She didn't beg. She attacked the legitimacy. Is the order signed by a judge? She demanded. It wasn't. It was administrative. And in that gap, between administrative and judicial, Margaret found a blade. Then it's not a warrant, she said. And you are not entering this NICU. She didn't just threaten lawsuits. She threatened public optics. Arrest a sitting justice in a hospital hallway while her daughter screams. Let's see how that looks on the 6 o'clock news. That's not melodrama. That's understanding how power actually moves. The state fears embarrassment more than it fears wrongdoing. The officers hesitated. They knew her. Respect is a currency too. And in that hesitation, CPS backed off, temporarily. Voss, Brandon's attorney, sneered as he left. Enjoy the baby while you can. We'll be back with paperwork by noon tomorrow. That line is poison, because it's true. The machine always comes back with cleaner documents. Margaret collapsed against the doors, realizing she'd bought hours, not safety. That's when she chose something dangerous. She stopped playing defense. She decided to hunt for the smoking gun tonight. Night in New York felt heavy, like the city itself was listening. Margaret went to the courthouse archives. Dust, old files, forgotten names. She wasn't looking for morality. She was looking for leverage. And she found a thread. A disgraced former partner of Mercer Logistics, a man Brandon had forced out, left to rot in a house that smelled like endings. When Margaret knocked, the man didn't act surprised. He'd seen the news. He'd been waiting for someone to finally come ask the right question. He told her Mercer Logistics wasn't just corrupt. It was collapsing. Bankrupt. 2 years deep. Brandon had been cooking books, using escrow accounts like a Ponzi scheme to keep the illusion alive. And if the board ever audited him, he'd go to federal prison for life. That's why the baby mattered. Not sentiment. Not legacy. Protection. Without an heir, he'd lose voting control and the auditors would descend like sharks. Margaret asked for proof. The man said Brandon kept a physical, air-gapped backup server at his summer estate, hidden in a boathouse he called a meditation room, proof in a floor safe, a red book, private vault of sins. Margaret walked back into the rain and headlights pinned her like an insect. 2 black SUVs blocked the driveway. A man stepped out with a tire iron, face forgettable, purpose unforgettable. And you should hear this clearly. The moment you threaten a powerful man's secret, you become an accident waiting to happen. Glass doesn't shatter politely. It explodes like truth when it finally breaks containment. The tire iron came through Margaret's window and for half a second the world was only sound. Rain, cracking glass, Haley's scream still echoing in her memory like a curse. Hands reached in, unlocked the door, and dragged her into the mud as if she weighed nothing. This is what power does when paper fails. It gets physical. It gets ancient. It gets simple. The man bent close and spoke like he was delivering customer service. You should have recused yourself. That sentence is a weapon. It reframes her refusal to abandon her daughter as professional misconduct. It turns a mother's protection into a procedural error. That's how predators maintain moral posture while committing evil. They accuse you of violating rules while they burn the rulebook. Margaret fought anyway, kicking, clawing, refusing to become a headline. The iron lifted, and for a heartbeat you could feel the universe preparing to erase her. Then a siren wailed in the distance and floodlights snapped on from the house behind them. The old partner, half dead in a wheelchair, had hit a panic alarm. Light hit the driveway like judgment. The attackers hesitated, cursed, shoved Margaret into the mud, and fled like roaches when the kitchen turned bright. Margaret lay there bleeding, rain mixing with the warm line down her forehead. She could have called an ambulance. She could have gone to the police. But here's the part that separates ordinary fear from war. She understood that reporting it would make her predictable. It would anchor her to official timelines, official statements, official visibility. And the same institutions that could protect her could also be pressured to expose her location. So she made a decision that is terrifying and, in her mind, necessary. She chose stealth. She canceled the call, dialed Haley's lawyer. Get Haley and the baby ready to move, she said, voice shaking, iron inside it. We're leaving the hospital. Now we're halfway down the rabbit hole, and this is where I need you to do something deliberate because you're not just watching a story. You're being trained to notice the architecture of control in your own life. If you're still with me, comment this phrase twice. Exactly like this. Iron awakens. Comment it 2 times. Not once, twice. It marks the moment you stop being entertained and start becoming alert. Because from here, the descent isn't about Brandon versus Haley. It's about how far a man will go when his hidden empire is built on fraud, and how far a system will bend to keep the appearance of normal. They drove to the Hamptons in winter, where mansions sit empty like skulls. Silent pools, dead gardens, iron gates that look ornamental until you realize they're there to keep consequences out. Margaret's car was battered, windshield cracked, wind screaming through the cabin, but she didn't slow down. She brought a detective with her, one of the few who still understood that law without courage is theater. They cut across the estate grounds, avoiding lights, moving like people who know they have no backup. The boathouse sat at the edge of a private dock, one security light blinking like a lazy eye. Inside, luxury. Teak floors, leather chairs, expensive cedar. A place designed to feel spiritual while hiding rot. Margaret flipped a Persian rug and found the floor safe. Her pulse lifted. This was it. Proof. The artery. Then the detective hissed what Margaret already feared. It needs a combination. And a thumbprint. Biometric. Of course. Brandon didn't trust clouds. He trusted control. He built locks that required his body. Because in his universe, access is permission and permission is dominance. And then a voice came from the shadows. Calm, conversational, soaked in certainty. You really are persistent, Margaret. Brandon Mercer rose from a chair like he'd been sitting there for hours, waiting. A gun in his hand caught the blink of the security light. The trap wasn't that the safe was locked. The trap was that he wanted her here, away from cameras, away from witnesses, away from the clean geometry of courtrooms. He wanted a fire, an accident. 2 intruders burned in a boathouse. A dead judge can't testify. A dead mother can't protect. The detective's hand drifted toward his holster. Brandon's voice sharpened. Don't. I have guards outside with rifles. You draw, you die. And the judge dies with you. Margaret stepped in front of the detective because she understood something you need to understand too. Predators don't just threaten you. They force you to calculate who you're willing to sacrifice. That's how they own the room. Margaret spat the truth at him. Ponzi scheme, cooked books, conspiracy. Brandon smiled like she'd complimented him. Knowledge is useless without proof, he said, tapping the safe with his foot. And you'll never open it. Then he delivered the ending he'd written. In 10 minutes, this boathouse catches fire.
Tragique électrical accident.
And right there, with a gun pointed and flames promised, Brandon finally said the quiet part out loud. Haley was never a person to him. She was a broodmare for an heir. And once the boy was born, he planned to break her mind permanently so she'd be easier to manage. If you're wondering why I'm telling you this like it's dangerous knowledge, it's because it is. Once you see how calmly evil speaks when it thinks it's private, you stop mistaking confidence for strength. The most lethal moment isn't when a gun is raised. It's when the man holding it thinks he's already won, because that's when he starts confessing. Brandon paced in that boathouse like a king giving a tour of his dungeon, tapping the safe with his foot, explaining the fire like it was a scheduled meeting. And Margaret, bleeding under her hairline, cold rain still living in her clothes, did something that looks small until you understand it. She stopped arguing and started collecting. Predators love an audience. It's a narcissistic law of gravity. If they think you're trapped, they'll monologue. They'll brag. They'll justify. They'll reveal the true structure underneath the charm. Brandon wasn't defending himself anymore. He was preaching. I deserve this, he said. Not I earned it. Deserve. That word tells you everything about his internal religion. Entitlement as divinity. Margaret stood between him and the detective, eyes locked, voice low. She didn't tremble. She didn't plead. She said, "You built nothing. You stole it." And Brandon's civility peeled back in strips. He admitted Haley was a tool. He admitted he planned to destroy her mind. He admitted he'd kill anyone who threatened his company. He thought he was terrifying her. What he was actually doing was giving her a rope. "Do you know what you have?" he asked, raising the pistol slightly, savoring it. "I have the money. I have the power." Margaret's answer was so calm it should make your throat tighten. "Do you?" She reached into her pocket. Brandon flinched, gun snapping toward her chest. "Hands where I can see them." And she slowly pulled out her phone. Not a weapon. A mirror. The screen glowed in the dim. Brandon stared like it was a bomb. "What is that?" "A live stream," Margaret said, turning it so he could see the interface and the climbing view count. Thousands. Then more. The internet doesn't sleep, and when it smells a confession, it gathers like a storm. In that instant, Brandon's control system failed at its root. Because every tactic he had relied on secrecy, isolation, confusion, closed rooms. He could hit a woman in a penthouse because no one would see. He could forge an obituary because only Haley would read it. He could weaponize CPS because forms don't bleed. But a live confession? A live confession turns power into evidence. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She spoke like a judge pronouncing reality into existence. "You just admitted to fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and arson. Live." Brandon lunged, not because he wanted the phone, but because he needed to reseal the box the truth was escaping from. The movement was animal fast. The gun went off. The shot in that small room was a thunderclap. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. Margaret's breath, the detective's stance, the blink of the security light. Brandon screamed and dropped the gun, clutching his shoulder. He hadn't hit Margaret. The detective had fired first, clean, controlled, the reflex of a man who's seen what happens when you hesitate. Then the door blew open. Not Brandon's guards. Federal agents. SWAT. Black armor, hard voices, weapons leveled. Down! Down! They flooded the boathouse as a consequence and were finally given legs. Brandon hit the teak floor face first. The same kind of polished wood he'd been pressed against when the bailiff cuffed him in court. History has a sense of symmetry when you force it. Here's the part people misunderstand. The live stream wasn't magic. It was a strategy. It was Margaret finally using the same principle Brandon lived by, control the narrative, but she used it for truth instead of manipulation. She dragged his private cruelty into public record, where money can't bribe silence as easily. As they hauled him up, bleeding and swearing, Brandon looked at Margaret with an expression that wasn't hatred anymore. It was disbelief, like a man waking up and realizing gravity is real. "You set me up," he rasped. Margaret stepped close, not as a mother now, but as the embodiment of the law he'd tried to purchase. Her voice was almost gentle, which made it worse. "Court is adjourned, Mr. Mercer. But understand this. Even with Brandon in cuffs, the deeper story isn't over. Because what you're watching is not only one man falling. It's a preview of how hidden empires work and how they collapse." 3 months later, the courtroom was packed. Not just reporters, ordinary men, ordinary women, the kind who know instinctively that watching a powerful predator get caged is a rare public ritual. Haley sat front row with Leo in her arms. No longer ghost-like, eyes clearer, posture steadier. Brandon stood gaunt in an ill-fitting suit. His elite attorney was gone, disbarred, sacrificed when he became inconvenient. That's another hidden truth. The powerful don't have loyal allies. They have disposable instruments. The verdict came down. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, assault, attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to decades that would swallow his prime years whole. And then, the final severing, parental rights terminated. Haley exhaled like a woman returning to her own body. But if you think the lesson is justice wins, you're still on the surface. The real lesson is that Brandon's world, his kind of world, exists everywhere. In boardrooms, in PR firms, in institutions that can be weaponized with the right language and the right money. The only reason this ended differently is because Margaret dragged the crime into the light and refused to let the machine write the story. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many men like Brandon never get a judge as a mother-in-law? How many women never get a live stream? How many accidents get filed away as tragedy? That's why this knowledge is dangerous. It makes you impossible to hypnotize with headlines. After the verdict, the cameras showed you what they always show. The spectacle of a fall. A billionaire in cuffs, a gavel slamming, a sentence spoken like a spell. People love that part because it lets them believe the world corrects itself automatically. But the correction doesn't happen automatically. It happens because someone pays in blood, fear, and sleepless nights to force reality into the open. And even then, the rot doesn't vanish. It adapts. Because Brandon Mercer was not an isolated monster. He was a product, manufactured by a culture that trains men to confuse domination with mastery and money with legitimacy. He didn't become abusive by accident. He became efficient at it. He studied the loopholes in people, the weak points in institutions, the places where policy ends and discretion begins. That's the real forbidden history here. The dark art isn't violence. It's permission. Look at the steps he took, and you'll recognize them everywhere once you know how to see. First, he built a gilded cage. Private jets, charity galas, diamonds, the public fairy tale. That phase isn't romance. It's acquisition. It's how predators purchase consent and then later claim ownership of it. Second, he separated Haley from mirrors. Family, friends, any voice that could contradict his. Isolation isn't loneliness. Isolation is monopolizing a person's reality. Third, he rewrote her world with false evidence. Intercepted letters, forged messages, and obituary. Gaslighting isn't just lying. It's architectural. It restructures someone's sense of time and truth until their own memory feels like a hostile witness. Then, when she tried to leave, he did what controlled men always do. He turned the system against her. Mental instability. Hormonal. No support. He didn't need to prove she was unfit. He only needed to make the court consider the possibility. In institutional spaces, possibility is leverage. Doubt is a weapon. And a woman with bruises often has the least credibility in the room because bruises can be reframed as drama, while suits are interpreted as stability. That's not a conspiracy. That's a bias pipeline, a psychological control system baked into culture. And when the court became dangerous to him, he switched arenas. He used PR. He used bot networks. He used professional liars who sell reputation management like it's marketing when it's really sabotage. He used CPS because nothing terrifies a mother like the state. He tried to remove Margaret with an accident because dead people don't file motions. Do you see the pattern? Each step is escalation, but each step is also plausible deniability. That's how institutional manipulation survives. It hides inside procedures. It doesn't need to be illegal if it's ambiguous. It just needs to be effective. Now zoom out even further because this is where the story becomes mythic. Not because it's supernatural, but because it repeats across history under different flags. In ancient courts, kings secured succession by controlling bloodlines and silencing rivals. In modern courts, executives secure succession by controlling voting shares and silencing whistleblowers. Different costumes, same ritual. The heir isn't a child. The heir is continuity of power. And every era produces men who believe they are entitled to it. Haley's son, Leo, was never just a baby to Brandon. He was a legal instrument, a biological signature required by a trust clause, a living key to a locked vault. That's why the story matters to the men watching this. It's a warning about what happens when you build your identity on external control. Brandon's whole sense of self was a corporate structure. When that structure threatened to collapse, he tried to sacrifice everyone inside it, wife, child, mother-in-law, anyone, to keep the illusion alive. Haley survived, but survival isn't the end. Survival is the beginning of the aftermath, rebuilding an identity that was deliberately dismantled. The script you were fed about her, fragile, hysterical, unstable, was designed to make you underestimate her. That's another trick of domination. It makes victims look small, so predators look inevitable. But Haley didn't stay small. She didn't heal into softness. She hardened into clarity. With her mother and her lawyer, she dissolved the foundation, renamed it, and turned the wreckage into a weapon for other women. That move is the reversal of control, taking what was used to imprison you and turning it into infrastructure for liberation. Still, don't romanticize it. Some men watching this will feel the urge to say, "Good, he got what he deserved. Done." That's how the mind protects itself from the deeper fear. That the same mechanics exist around you right now, in HR departments, in family courts, in media cycles, in corporate boards, in the way narratives are purchased and sold. The Mercer story went viral because it looks exceptional. It went viral because the judge stood up and revealed she was the mother. That cinematic twist makes it feel rare. The truth is the twist is rare. The abuse isn't. So here's the question you should be asking yourself now. Not about Brandon, but about your own world. Where are you being trained to accept someone else's narrative because it comes with polished language and institutional backing? Where are you being nudged to doubt what you saw with your own eyes because a confident man told you a better story? If you can answer that honestly, you're not just watching the rabbit hole. You're inside it. There's a reason this story grabs men by the collar and doesn't let go. It isn't just the courtroom slap. It's the realization that a man can build an empire and still be a coward, because the moment he loses control, he reaches for violence, propaganda, and bureaucracy like they're extensions of his body. That isn't strength. That's dependency. It's an addiction dressed as authority. If you're watching this for elite knowledge, here it is in plain sight. The world isn't run by the smartest people. It's run by the people most willing to manipulate the frame. Brandon's real talent wasn't logistics. It was framing. He framed Haley as unstable. He framed Margaret as corrupt. He framed himself as a loving husband. He framed a child as a corporate requirement. And he framed the state as his private security team by weaponizing its processes. That's why forbidden history matters. Not because of secret societies and cloaks, but because the oldest agenda on Earth is the same one wearing new suits today. Control the story, control the people. Ancient corruption didn't vanish. It modernized. It moved into PR firms, legal strategy, social services, and the quiet rooms where paperwork becomes a weapon. Think about the CPS tactic again. It wasn't a mistake. It was a psychological nuke. When the state threatens to take your child, you don't think in paragraphs. You think in screams. That's the point. It collapses a person's higher reasoning and forces compliance through terror. And here's the darker layer. It also stains the victim permanently. Even if the claim is false, the allegation lingers like smoke in the file. That's how institutional manipulation creates truth without evidence, by leaving residue. Now, connect that to the reputation campaign against Margaret. Bots whispering bribes. A former clerk, ready to testify. None of it needed to be proven. It only needed to exist long enough for doubt to become public. That is the internet's shadow utility. It doesn't have to convince everyone. It only has to fracture certainty. Once certainty fractures, the powerful can negotiate reality. So why did Brandon miscalculate? Why did he slap her in court? Where cameras and stenographers exist, where consequences can't be edited out. Because entitlement erodes discipline. The longer a man gets away with domination, the more he believes consequences are myths for other people. That's why tyrants always get sloppy. They mistake survival for invincibility. Margaret's counterattack wasn't just legal. It was psychological. She used the one thing Brandon couldn't buy once it escaped him. Public record. The live stream wasn't a gimmick. It was a reversal of isolation. It dragged his private confession into a space where witnesses multiply endlessly. In ancient times, the equivalent was forcing a tyrant to confess in the town square. Today, the town square is a feed that never forgets. But don't misunderstand. Public attention is a sword with two edges. Can free you and it can brand you. Haley became a symbol overnight. Symbols attract predators, parasites, opportunists, people who want to support you while feeding off your story. That's another hidden agenda of institutions and media. Suffering becomes content, and content becomes currency. Even justice can be monetized. So Haley and Margaret had to do what most victims never get the chance to do. Take ownership of the narrative before someone else packaged it. They dissolved the Mercer Foundation and rebuilt it as something else. Phoenix, rebirth through fire. That's mythic language because humans understand transformation through symbols. And symbols matter because the mind is built from them. Brandon controlled Haley by controlling symbols. Marriage, motherhood, respectability, family. Haley broke free by creating new symbols. Survival, truth, protection, purpose. And now comes the part you need to hear like a warning bell. Men like Brandon don't disappear when one is imprisoned. The ecosystem continues. The lawyers who learn to spin violence into hormones will represent someone else next week. The reputation managers who plant bot stories will take another contract tomorrow. The social systems that can be weaponized will be weaponized again because they were built with pressure points. That's why this story is more than a drama. It's a field manual. It shows you the anatomy of control, a charming entry, a gilded cage, isolation from mirrors, reality forgery, institutional weaponization, narrative warfare, then elimination attempts. If you can see that anatomy, you can spot it early, in relationships, in workplaces, in politics, in the way people try to train you to doubt what you witnessed. This is where self-mastery actually begins. Not with motivational slogans, but with perception. The man who sees clearly is harder to program. So let me mentor you straight, without comfort. You will never be safe because the world is fair. You will only be safer because you can detect manipulation before it becomes your reality. The difference between a controlled man and a free man is not strength. It's awareness under pressure. And in this story, the pressure never stopped. Even after the cuffs, even after the verdict, even after the sentence. There was still the question that sits underneath everything. How close did Haley come to disappearing without anyone ever knowing the truth? How many women do disappear that way? When you sit with that, you stop watching this like entertainment. You start watching it like a warning meant for you. Now we go to the place most stories refuse to enter, because it's not cinematic. It's quieter. It's the afterlife of control. The part where the abuser is gone but the programming remains, echoing in the victim's decisions like a voice that still pays rent in her head. Haley didn't just survive Brandon. She had to survive the version of herself he engineered. The woman who flinches before a door opens, who apologizes for taking up space, who hears a confident man speak and instinctively assumes he must be right. That's the deepest psychological prison. Bruises heal faster than beliefs. In the months after the trial, the public saw a clean arc. Monster punished, mother restored, baby safe. But inside Haley, the real case began. Her nervous system had been trained to anticipate violence the way a sailor anticipates storms. Subtly, constantly, even on sunny days. Hospitals, courtrooms, cameras, headlines. They don't feel like victory to someone who's been trapped. They feel like exposure, like standing in the open field after living underground. And that's where institutional manipulation returns in a new form. Not through CPS orders or bail motions, but through social perception. People stare. People whisper. Some offer help. Some offer judgment disguised as curiosity. Why didn't she leave sooner? That question is a confession of ignorance. It's like asking why a man didn't swim faster while someone held his head underwater. You don't just leave when your reality has been confiscated. You leave when you can see an exit and believe it's real. Margaret knew that. She didn't push Haley into performative strength. She built conditions for actual safety. A new location, new routines, security, legal walls, predictable days. Because trauma doesn't heal through speeches. It heals through repetition of non-danger. And that takes time Brandon tried to steal. Haley also had to face something men rarely talk about honestly. Shame. Not guilt, shame. The sense that she had been fooled, that her judgment was broken, that her own mind betrayed her. This is where predators win even after they lose, because shame keeps the victim silent and isolated, which recreates the cage without any locks. Shame makes a woman hide, and when a woman hides, the world assumes she's fine. But Haley didn't hide forever because she had a lever most victims don't. She had proof, witnesses, and a mother who understood procedure like anatomy. Together with Sarah, no longer just the tired court-appointed attorney, but a strategist with teeth, they built the Phoenix Trust, a platform designed to do one thing: intercept the pattern early. Legal clinics, financial education, emergency housing, a hotline staffed by people trained to recognize coercive control, not just physical bruises. That's the real rebellion, building counter-infrastructure. Not yelling at darkness, but creating systems that outlast individual monsters. And here's the darker truth, the one men need to grasp if they're serious about self-mastery. Brandon didn't only abuse Haley, he corrupted everyone around him. He trained lawyers to lie smoothly. He trained employees to look away. He trained doormen to deny a mother entry. He trained institutions to accept his framing. Control spreads like a fungus. It turns ordinary people into accessories because it rewards silence and punishes resistance. That's why I keep calling this dangerous knowledge. Because once you see how control spreads socially, you can't unsee your own complicity. Every time you ignore a red flag because it's inconvenient, you reinforce the ecosystem. Every time you believe a polished man over a trembling woman because he seems credible, you're donating your perception to power. So what's the suppressed truth hidden in plain sight? It's this: society is full of men who think they're strong because they can intimidate, but intimidation is a nervous system strategy. It's fear management. Real mastery is the opposite. The ability to hold power without needing to crush anyone to feel whole. Brandon couldn't do that. He needed ownership to feel real. And when ownership was threatened, he tried to burn the world down. That's not masculinity. That's emptiness with a suit. If you're a man watching this in America, 18 or 69, doesn't matter, understand what the story is asking you to become. The kind of man who can recognize the difference between power and control. Power is internal capacity. Control is external coercion. Power builds. Control consumes. And there's one more revelation. Brandon's greatest mistake wasn't hitting Haley in court. His greatest mistake was assuming nobody would risk their own comfort to oppose him. He believed everyone had a price. Margaret proved him wrong. The detective proved him wrong. The officers in the hospital hallway proved him wrong. Not because they were saints, but because at a certain point, a man's conscience wakes up and decides, not this time. That decision is the hinge of history. Most of the world's dark chapters happen because too many people refuse to make it. So here's what I want you to carry out of this section like a weapon you keep hidden. When you see the pattern, charm, isolation, reality control, institutional weaponization, don't wait for a slap in a courtroom. That's the late stage. Intervene at the early stage. Ask better questions. Protect the vulnerable. Document what you can. Refuse the narrative that says, it's complicated, when what it really means is, someone is being owned. Because if you don't, the next Haley won't get a mother on the bench. She'll get silence. And silence is the oldest accomplice. You've reached the bottom of the rabbit hole, which means you have a choice most men never realize they're making. You can climb back out and tell yourself this was just a wild story about a rich psychopath who finally got caught. Or you can accept what the story was really trying to do. Change the way you see power forever. Because once you recognize the machinery, you start noticing it everywhere, in relationships, in workplaces, in headlines, in the way institutions speak when they want obedience. Here's the final truth, and it's not comforting. The world doesn't run on justice. It runs on enforcement. Justice is the name we give to enforcement we agree with. Brandon Mercer lived as long as he did without consequence because his enforcement was stronger than Haley's. Money bought attorneys, PR, access, and delay. Delay is a weapon. It exhausts the victim until surrender feels like peace. That's why so many men like him never need to win in court. They only need to make the other side too tired to stand. What stopped him wasn't fate. It was a convergence of rare factors. A judge who recognized her daughter, a public act of violence that couldn't be hidden, a mother willing to weaponize procedure against him, and a moment where secrecy broke. Most victims don't get that convergence. That's why your awareness matters. Not as entertainment, as a responsibility. And now, let's talk directly man-to-man, mentor to student, without moral theater. If you want elite knowledge, stop chasing fantasies about shadowy councils and coded handshakes. The real hidden force is simpler and more brutal. The ability to define reality for someone else. That's what coercive control is. It's not a punch. It's authorship. The abuser becomes the editor of the victim's life. Cutting scenes, rewriting motives, deleting allies, inserting fear. Brandon tried to author Haley. He tried to author Margaret. He tried to author the public. And for a while, he succeeded. That's why he got arrogant. Because the most intoxicating drug for a certain kind of man is watching other people doubt themselves. So what do you do with this? You start by recognizing the soft tells of manipulation. Not just in others, in yourself. When you feel the urge to dismiss someone's pain because it inconveniences your worldview, that's a tell. When you feel relief at believing the polished version because it's simpler, that's a tell. When you assume authority equals virtue, that's a tell. This is self-mastery. Catching your own mind reaching for easy narratives. Then you build a personal doctrine because men without doctrine get programmed. Here's one you can adopt, sharpen, and live by. Never let charisma override evidence. Never let status replace character. Never confuse fear with respect. And never call control love. The mythic layer of this story, the part that feels like legend, is not the judge was her mother. The mythic layer is that a mother's love outlasted a forged obituary, a locked penthouse, and a billionaire's war machine. That's why it went viral. Because deep down, people are starving for proof that the machine can be beaten. But don't get it twisted. The machine doesn't get beaten by hope. It gets beaten by exposure, documentation, alliances, and relentless pressure. By men and women who refuse to be hypnotized by wealth. By institutions forced to act because the public is watching. By the kind of courage that isn't loud. It's stubborn. So if you want to leave this video changed, take one action that proves it. Not a like button. Not a subscription. An action in your real life. Pay attention to the women around you. Listen for the language of isolation. He doesn't like my friends. My family is toxic now. He reads my messages. I'm always apologizing. Those aren't quirks. Those are early warning flares. And if you're a man who recognizes those traits in yourself, if control feels like safety, if jealousy feels like love, if dominance feels like identity, then this is your moment to choose a different lineage. Because Brandon's lineage ends in a cell. Alone, hollow, still insisting he deserved it. That's the graveyard of control. Haley walked out with her son and her mother, not because the world became kind, but because she stopped accepting a reality written by someone else. Margaret retired from the bench and became what she should have been all along. A shield, not a symbol. And the Phoenix Trust, whether you see it as real or mythic, represents the only kind of power worth respecting, power that protects instead of consumes. Now you know what happens when a man confuses ownership for strength. You know what happens when institutions can be weaponized with the right words. And you know the price of silence. If you've listened this far, you're no longer the same viewer who clicked for a courtroom twist. You've seen the anatomy, and once you see it, you can't unsee it.